There are many obstacles that can block the path to a successful software project. When you come across one, it helps to think like a seasoned hiker and follow the trail marked by blue blazes around the problem so that you can get back on course and keep moving forward. Welcome to Blue Blazes Podcast. I'm your host for the journey, Jay Tower, and I'm a partner and principal consultant at Trailhead Technology Partners. In this series, we talk with industry experts who share their best tips for avoiding the pitfalls on the path to successful software projects. My guest on this episode of Blue Blazes is Varun Vachhar, a front-end developer and DX engineer with a focus on UI architecture, design systems, and developer tooling. Varun is one of the maintainers of the Storybook project and part of the developer experience team at Chromatic. He's also a generative artist in his spare time. In this episode, Varun and I dive into how Storybook helps teams design, document, and test UI components in isolation. We talk about its impact on code quality and team collaboration. We also talk about what's coming in Storybook 9. If you build web user interfaces, this one's for you. I hope you enjoy. Well, hey, Varun, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So you're here representing Chromatic, your company, and also Storybook, the product that they make. For somebody who hasn't heard of Storybook before, what is it and how does it help front-end developers?
For sure. So Storybook is an open source tool that allows you to render components in isolation. So usually when you're building an application, you have a bunch of components, you throw them on a page. But when you want to work on a component, it's hard to replicate all the different states of that component. So depending on data being passed into it, the application state, the network state, maybe there's an error, the component can render differently. So Storybook is a tool that allows you to detach components from the application and render them one at a time. And then while it's being rendered, you can control any kind of dependency for that component. Props going in, mocked dependencies, API requests that can be mocked, anything really that the component requires to render a particular scenario. That's kind of the crux of Storybook, which is helpful as a tool for developers. And then there's a bunch of things you layer on top of it. It allows you to write documentation for that component and even run tests on top of it.
Jay here. Just a quick break in the conversation to share how Trailhead can help you tackle your toughest business challenges. When you're navigating uncharted technology terrain, Trailhead creates custom software solutions that put you back on the path to success. Ready for the next step? Get started with an expert consultation at trailheadtechnology.com/offer. That's trailheadtechnology.com/offer. Now back to the conversation. Okay. So a lot of times somebody will make a UI component in one of the modern JavaScript frameworks, and then maybe that's 17 clicks to get to the screen. That's a pop-up within a screen within a certain user's login to actually see that component rendering data and make sure it's working the way you want. Sounds like Storybook is kind of almost like a sandbox where you can play with those components independently.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the thing, right? Like you're working on, let's say, handling a particular error case in a component. You have to click through to get to that state. You change a bit of code. HMR kicks in or the app refreshes, and you have to do a bunch of that work all over again. So instead of having to repeat all of that with this sandbox approach, you can just get to that state right away. I've been using it for many years now, even before I joined Chromatic, and it's been a lifesaver for sure.
Yeah. So I think we're through the phase of web development history where there's a new JavaScript framework every week, but there's a lot of them out there. So question for you, does Storybook support my favorite JavaScript framework? Fill in the blank.
Yeah, definitely. So Storybook did start off in the React ecosystem. Initially, it was built just for React components, but over the years, it's added support for just about every major JavaScript framework out there, including web components. So if you're using something like lit HTML or Ionic to or is it Compositor? I mix up the two.
But yeah.
So any kind of flavor of web component that usually ends up being supported too.
Yeah, great. So you mentioned that, when you create these UI components and you want to play with them in the sandbox environment and see how they work, that one of the things that's valuable is to be able to kind of run them through all of their different modes, paces, settings, whatever you want to call it. How's that work in Storybook?
Yeah, so the idea is quite similar to testing um, functions. So, but when you're working on a function, you'll write a test file for it, and you have these test cases where you pass in some inputs and you're asserting whatever the output is. So in Storybook, you use a file format called stories, stories.js or TS, depending on your choice. And for each component, you write individual stories, and one story is essentially a test case. So in order to render, let's say if you're working with a button, maybe you can pass some text into the button for the label. You can specify an icon. Icon could be on the left-hand side or the right-hand side. All of those are usually configured as inputs into the component. So in the story file, you'd be able to specify what inputs do I need to pass into my component for this particular story. And then you would follow that process to write out all the different other states for that component. Now for a button, that's relatively straightforward, mostly just inputs. But as you get to more complex components, you might have things like there are, uh, you know, uh, the component is pulling in data through some kind of hook or decorator, or like some kind of global state management. And Storybook allows you to mock that information too, or if it's making API requests, there's a Storybook add-on for mock service worker that allows you to even mock the the data coming from API requests, so you can simulate different scenarios for that component.
Nice. So it almost sounds like the story is almost like a test or a unit test in the sense
Yeah,
of, yeah.
yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I would say so that is sort of been our big focus the last couple of years, is to actually turn them into tests. So
Mm.
um, I'm sure, like in the early days of the sort of more modern component-based frameworks, you might be familiar with the idea of running DOM snapshot tests. So we were putting so much code into components, and then people realized actually we should probably test them. And the best thing we came up with was DOM snapshots. And that is helpful, but very quickly you get to a point where people stop paying attention to what's in the snapshot and just hitting accept and moving on.
Mm.
So we wanted to change that, and we wanted to actually allow you to write tests on these components. So more recently, we added this idea of a play function. So you can attach a play function to the story. So let's say if you want to simulate some kind of user interaction, like the user is filling out a form and they fill out a field incorrectly, that triggers some kind of validation error. So the same kind of stuff you would do in a unit test using something like a testing library or Jest or VTest, that all of that information just goes into the play function. And in fact, it is using either Jest or VTest, just versions of it that's been instrumented for Storybook. And then Storybook will run that test for you within Storybook, or on the command line if you prefer that instead.
Yeah. Now, Storybook currently is an open source project. I know it's also most heavy contributor is Chromatic, where you work. And that Chromatic also offers some paid services that you can add on top of that. So what's the difference between the unpaid and paid versions of Storybook? What do you get?
Yeah, so primarily Chromatic is a testing service. So we feel since you're building applications using a component-driven model, that is the best way to run tests too. So instead of reinventing the wheel, we took what people were using already, which is Storybook, and built a service on top of it. And currently, we offer two different types of testing services. One is for visual testing, and the other is accessibility testing. So I'll start with visual testing. So I talked about those DOM snapshots that were not very helpful, but I think that is very helpful is if you run visual regression testing for your front ends. So that's what Chromatic does. It takes your entire storybook, looks at all the stories inside it, runs them in the browser, in the cloud, and captures a snapshot of it. And then on every commit or every time you open up a pull request, it will compare what is the current version of that component versus the previously accepted baseline snapshot that was captured. And if there's any changes, it alerts you to it. And then
Nice.
the other tool is accessibility testing. So that is one of the most popular add-ons in Storybook is the accessibility add-on. It's built on top of Axe. So essentially, you're running Axe on individual components, states of individual components. So again, Chromatic does that for you now in the cloud. It runs all of those tests for you in parallel. And it takes a more of a regression-based approach to accessibility testing because it's unlikely your app is fully accessible, and it's unlikely you're going to make it accessible in one pull request. So Chromatic allows you to track sort of what issues are present in each component currently, and then as I modify code, am I adding to that or fixing some things, and you can see that delta.
Nice. So it sounds like you're free to use Storybook for whatever you want, including maybe kind of rolling your own solutions to testing. But if you want to just get it out of the box, you can use Chromatic services built on top of that to get that kind of snapshot testing and accessibility testing
Totally.
easily.
Yeah.
That's really great. You also mentioned add-ons. I know there's a rich community of add-ons. Can you talk a little bit about the types of things that are available out there as add-ons that people are getting a lot of value out of?
Totally. So, like one of the complexities of the front-end ecosystem is there are so many different CSS frameworks, so many different state management libraries or any kind of tools you might be using. So some of the add-ons just address that. They just allow you to render components inside Storybook, regardless of which tool that you might be using. So maybe like you're using Tailwind and you want to plug into the Tailwind build system and still be able to render your component. So there's a whole suite of add-ons for that. Then there are add-ons that just make your life easier as a developer. So one of the really interesting ones is the design add-on, which allows you to link Figma files to components. So Figma, again, has a pretty much a component-based model. So you can almost have a one-to-one map between what's in Figma and what's in Storybook. So you can go and say this particular component inside Figma is tied to this particular component inside my Storybook. And then when you pop open the add-ons panel, it just takes you to that component within the Figma file, and you can see the designs and the coded components side by side. So you're not jumping between tools to see, do my designs match my component? Or if you're working on a new component, then you have the spec right there without having to jump between tools.
That's nice.
And then there's like a whole host of tools like that make mocking easier. So I'll mention Mock Service Worker again, which is a really cool tool. It uses service workers to mock API requests that you might be making within your application, within a test or within a story. And then similarly, if you might be using Apollo or any other type of API services, there are add-ons that similarly allow you to mock API requests for those tools.
Okay. Well, that sounds really useful. I think there's another tool that's called Viewport that lets you view things, in different responsive sizes as well. That's one that I know we found useful.
Yeah, I should mention, so there are a whole bunch of add-ons that are sort of we feel are essential, so that we just ship Storybook with it. So Viewport is one of them. Another one is for theming. So quite often you might have components that support light theme, dark theme, or different brand themes. So it allows you to switch theme from the Storybook UI, so you can see your component in different themes, or trigger like dark mode, just to see what the component looks like in that dark mode.
Okay. Well, digging in a little bit to how Storybook actually works, as I was researching before our conversation today, I found some stuff online that talked about how important it is that Storybook runs your components in isolation from each other, and referencing things like large applications, things like micro front ends where things are split up into multiple projects. Can you talk a little bit about why that isolation is so important?
Yeah, absolutely. So one critical piece is just it's so easy to spin up a new component, and unless you have a really good idea of what components are in your code base already, people end up duplicating components quite a lot. So by running them in isolation, you have Storybook essentially acts as like a dictionary for all the components in your code base. So you can go and see what exactly is in my code base already? Is there something that I can use for my purposes already? Of course, you have that code in your code base, but a large part of the component is it renders something visually. And just by looking at the code, you can't necessarily say this is exactly what it does, or you might have to reference a design file. So instead of jumping through all those hoops, by rendering things in isolation, you can just go and see what all is available to you. And then secondly, I think rendering in isolation is another key piece for I think it helps you get to better architecture for your application. Just like, if you're writing any kind of code, if it is heavily intertwined with other bits of code, it just becomes really hard to test it, really hard to maintain it.
Mm.
And same thing with components. If you write components in a way where they're easy to be rendered in isolation, it means they have fewer dependencies or dependencies that can be easily mocked, which means you can test them more easily, you can maintain them more easily, you can reuse them in a lot more cases.
Yeah. So is it fair to say the same thing applies to unit tests?
Totally.
Basically.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Being isolatable is a valuable thing for testability.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when you publish your storybook, you can publish it as static HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. How have you seen teams using that to share that site internally? Probably usually, unless it's a product, maybe a component product. How are they usually sharing that internally, and what advantages are you seeing them get out of that?
Yeah, I'd say the sort of first big um, moment of growth for Storybook was around when design systems started. So a lot of design systems adopted Storybook and started publishing their Storybook as the documentation for their design system. So whether that's internal or even if you just want to share your design system more publicly, you have this site up and running. So consumers of your design system, which might be within your company, and if it's an open source project, it might be anyone who has access to it. They can go to that website, the published Storybook, to see how do I use this component. It will show you the API of the component. You can play with the live components in the browser. So being able to play with the live components is super helpful. And then again, you can modify the props using Storybook controls. So if you want to see, what happens if I'm working on a particular feature right now for this component, the heading needs to be super long. If I put a really long heading in there, does it still work or does it break? Do I need to modify this component? You can play with that before even having to pull the code and use it in your own code base.
Yeah, super useful. Even you mentioned before how sometimes components can get copied around, and knowing that there's already a component in the application that does what you need just by having sort of a library available for the developers to look at can be useful.
Totally.
If you maybe haven't worked on that part of the application where it was already created, oh, look, I can just build off of this, not reinvent the wheel. You mentioned documentation too. And I know one of the features Storybooks allows is using Markdown for documentation right in your components. So can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah. So Markdown and MDX are sort of the two big offerings for that. So if you are using something like JS.comments or if you're using TypeScript, generally there's a lot of information about the component already in your code base. So Storybook will go and pull that info to generate a props table, essentially like an API table for your component, where these are all the inputs into my component. What type of values do they accept? What are the default values? And then it's not just a static API table, but it's something you can play with. So you get control. So if it's like a string type input, you'll get a text box where you can input the value or change the value to see what it looks like. If it's accepts sort of more like an enum type where you can have multiple values, you might get a drop down to choose different values. So you can actually play with the component, which is very helpful. And then all of those other stories that you've written, those are test cases for the component, right? But they're also documentation cases. So what are the different ways? Say if I have a card component, how many different ways can I render the card component? You might have scenarios where you have an image within the card. You might have actions that you can pass in optionally, or some kind of metadata you can pass in optionally. All of those scenarios are captured for you, so you can go and see what they look like and what does the code for the component look like. Not the implementation details, but if I'm using this component and I want to pass in some actions, what does that look like in code? You get that code sample right there too.
Nice.
And just touching about that Markdown and MDX bit, because you have, so Storybook will generate this documentation page for you automatically. But if you want to customize it more and put in more things in there, you can optionally add in a Markdown or an MDX file that sits alongside the stories file. And then within that, you have the option to write more details, embed more assets that you want to, or add more context. And because it's Markdown or MDX, you can throw in more components in there, and you can totally customize it whatever way you want.
Okay. And for everyone's edification, what's the difference between Markdown and MDX?
So MDX is a superset of Markdown. So by default, you can just write Markdown and it'll render that. But it also allows you to import and render React components inside it. Primarily, I believe they also support Vue, but in most cases, I've seen folks just use it with React components. So if you want to customize the Storybook UI and put in something on the Markdown page that is not part of Storybook's default offering, you have the option to do that.
Okay. Well, now at the time that we're having this conversation, Storybook version 9 is pretty close to being ready for release. Can you give us a little bit of a preview of what is in that version number?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say the first big thing is testing. One of the really cool things that's happened in the front end ecosystem is Wheat's kind of taken over a lot of things, and Vitest has come in as pretty much a drop-in replacement for Jest. So we've created a new integration with Vitest that allows you to take your stories and turn them into Vitest test. And if you have a play function attached to it, it's going to run the whole thing and make sure that the tests are passing. If you don't have a play function attached to your story, then it will simply render the story and make sure that this component is rendering correctly, either in the browser or in a headless browser, depending on how you're running Vitest. And then there's other types of testing that Storybook offers, like accessibility or visual testing, which does rely on Chromatic. And all of that is packaged into this new testing module, which shows up within Storybook. So you can just start running tests as when you start up Storybook, and they're running inside Storybook. And if there's any failures, you get data report in the sidebars. You can go and see why a particular story is failing. And then on top of that, there's a bunch of life improvements, I would say. So historically, Storybook's been pretty heavy, definitely a criticism we get quite a lot. So we've been slowly trimming it over the years, and now this particular release is the actual bundle size is 48% lighter. If you go to the Storybook blog and see their release announcement, there's a sort of side-by-side comparison of the dependency tree, and it's really, really trimmed down. So that's super nice, because it just means less dependencies. It's easier to update, and just things just work much better.
Sure.
And then the last big one I would say is tag-based organization. So some of the larger storybooks can have like 2,000-3,000 stories. That's not uncommon. And at that scale, it's hard to sort of go and see which one are relevant to me, or like in a particular scenario. So now you can go and attach tags to stories. So if you want to filter stories based on stuff that you just use for testing, or stuff that you just use for documentation, or things that are purely atomic components, you can really quickly go and filter that in the Storybook sidebar.
Nice. And I don't know if it's too early to give out this information, but when can we expect all of that to be available in full release?
It should be out right now, as we're talking. I know it's very close, so yeah, you can go and try it today for sure. Depending on the day today, if it's either in RC or it's ready to use, but
Okay.
you can definitely go give it a go.
And where should somebody go if they want to get started with Storybook and check it out?
The best place to go get started is the Storybook documentation site, storybookjs.org. We also have a Discord you can join. There's a link to it on the side in the footer. Most of the maintainers tend to hang out there. If you're running into any questions or any kind of issues, that's the best place to go ask.
Okay. And if someone's interested in Chromatic and the testing suite of offerings there, how do they check that out?
So for Chromatic, I would say just go to chromatic.com. We do offer a free plan. So if you just want to try it and see, how it works and whether it fits with your workflow or not, you get 5,000 snapshots a month for free. And I believe like 35,000 or 75,000 on the first month. So you get plenty to try it out and see if it fits your needs or not. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that sounds great. So we're running out of time here, but I should have warned you about this ahead of time because it's a question I like to ask all of our guests on the podcast, which is, we've just been talking about Storybook, but what other topics or guests do you think would be valuable on the broader theme of this podcast, which is making software projects more predictably successful?
So, I've mentioned mock service worker a couple of times now. So I would recommend talking to Artem Zakharchenko, I believe is how the name is pronounced. He is the lead maintainer of mock service worker. It is a really fantastic tool. So if you're doing any kind of testing, you are likely having to mock API requests somewhere in that stack. And I've tried many things over the years, and MSW is a really, 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 really cool tool. It's not Storybook specific. It works detached from Storybook. There's flavors for pretty much every testing framework, but it makes it really easy to mock API requests, to do things like, what does my UI look like if there's like a massive delay, or it errors out, or it just never returns a value, things like that. It just makes that trivial and allows for really complex mocking. So, on the first request, you might get correct data, but the second time you make a request, then you hit some kind of error. You can do all that kind of stuff too. And regardless of whether you're using straight up REST API or GraphQL, it works with both, or even WebSockets for that matter.
Sure. Okay. Sounds great. Thanks for the suggestion. We'll definitely look into that one. And thank you for your expertise on Storybook and your time talking with me about it today.
Thanks a lot. It was great talking to you. Thanks for having me again.
That's the end of this Blue Blazes podcast. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this one with industry experts focused on how to make software projects more predictably successful, make sure to subscribe. Trailhead can be found online at trailheadtechnology.com, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks for listening.